I want to give a special shout out to all of our teachers and students. You made it. We're at the last week of school. You know what that means. Absolutely nothing if you have small kids. Same thing day after day, but I know that for a lot of people, you're transitioning into a season that'll be marked by summer camps and family vacations. And even here at Bridgepoint, our church family has some different rhythms during the summertime. And so we have a couple of life groups that we're offering this summer because we believe that the best thing that you can do for your spiritual growth is not to be in a room like this staring at the back of somebody's head in front of you, but to sit around a table or to get in a living room and turn so you're facing one another, you're opening up, you're sharing. And one thing that we're doing a little bit different this summer, we're just trying something new, is we're going to go old school. We're going to have a couple of church-wide potlucks. Can I get an amen on that? It's going to be a lot of fun. We have 3 of them on the schedule. They're June 5th, June 12th, and July 10th. Those are all Sundays. They'll be in the evening time, and you don't have to come to all of them, but we'd love for you to be a part of any of those that you can be. It's a great way to connect and meet some people that you may not get a chance to meet otherwise. Again, we just believe community is so important and would love for you guys to take that next step. Now, this morning, we're continuing right along in this series we've been in called Lies We Believe. And really, the idea behind this series is that it kind of follows all the other stuff we've been talking about all the way back to January. Because we kicked off the year by doing a series called How We Change. Anybody remember that? Yes, a couple. All right, thank you. That encourages me. You know, we got 1 or 2. But in this series, we said that a lot of times we struggle to change because we don't know what it is that influences who we are. And there's been studies that show that who we are is really influenced by 3 things. It's what we believe, where we belong, and how we behave. And so we've even talked this morning about the importance of belonging with other people who are going to help you become more like Jesus. And if you want to become like him, there's certain behaviors or practices, sometimes they're called spiritual disciplines, that we want to put into place in our life, like prayer and fasting and worship. But then I think for a lot of us, what this series is really trying to point out is that for a lot of us, all those other things are out of whack because we're not believing the right things. Here's what I mean. If what we believe shapes how we view the world, then I think the enemy's number 1 tactic, right? We talk about spiritual warfare sometime. His number 1 tactic is not going to be to try to possess you. It's not going to be to make your car engine blow up tomorrow morning. No, the way the enemy wants to attack is by planting lies in your mind because that will impact how you live. It will impact what you believe about the world. And so we've said that the scary thing is not that some of us are believing lies, but we're actually living lies. Like maybe somebody told you at some point in your life that you are unlovable, and that shaped the way that you live your life. Maybe some of you it was a lie about God, that he's wrathful and angry, and he's just looking for an opportunity to crush you, and that's impacted your relationship with him. But there's a number of lies that we believe. And we've kind of zeroed in on 8 of these that were kind of pointed out by the church desert fathers and mothers. This is a group of Christians in the 3rd and 4th century who left the urban areas to go out to monasteries in the Egyptian desert. And man, they really hit that behave part of the 3 things. And they wanted to put all these things into practice. They're not so great with the belonging because, you know, they went out into the desert. But as they started these practices, they realized that one man in particular, Evagrius, he pointed out there's 8 primary lies that we believe. And when we believe these lies, he said all sin flows from that. And so we've just been looking at those different lies. The first week, we talked about gluttony and lust and avarice and how this is the lie of more. And we think if I can just have more things, if I can just eat more food, if I can just have more sex, then I will be satisfied, then I will be complete, and I'll have everything that I've ever wanted. But the reality is that that's the lie. The truth is that we don't need more stuff. We just need more of Jesus. In fact, I was talking to my wife this week, and the thought occurred to me that Jesus was homeless. He didn't have a nice house. He didn't have a nice car. He depended on other people for hospitality. Jesus never got married. He never had sex. And yet he was still a complete person. See, we think we need all those things to be satisfied, but the reality is Jesus had the only thing that satisfies, and that's a deep, intimate relationship with his Father. And so we just want to follow in his footsteps. We also talked about the lie of discontent and how sometimes we get discontented in our certain season and place in life. And so we think that if we leave where we are and head over there, then things will be better. Right? Like, oh, if I just leave the relationship I'm in and pursue that one, things will be different. If I just leave the job I'm in and pursue that one, things will be better. If I just leave the city I'm in to move somewhere else, then life will finally make sense. But the reality is some of us are leaving the place that God has us, and we're missing out on all the fruit that he wants to bring about in our lives as a result. And so we have to remain faithful even in the face of discontent. And last week even we talked about the lie of dejection and despair. And that there are times in life where reality doesn't live up to our expectation. And so oftentimes we wonder, why didn't God show up the way I expected? And we get frustrated in our relationship with him. And we talked about how God wants to journey with us even through seasons of dejection and despair. But this morning, we're kind of winding down the series, and we're going to be talking about the lie that I think probably best describes the culture we live in today. In fact, it's not going to surprise you at all that this describes our current climate in our nation, because today we're talking about anger. In fact, I think that we could say that we live in an angry culture, right? It's been called an outrage culture. You got to be angry and upset about every little thing, right? You turn on the news, people are upset. You get on social media and people are upset. I saw a big debate on social media yesterday. Somebody said that red Doritos were better than blue Doritos, right? I mean, people get pretty defensive about their Dorito flavors, right? They're always angry about something. And in fact, there's a social commentator named David Brooks, and back in 2017, so pre-pandemic, he wrote about how we have adopted in our nation this siege mentality, that everybody feels like their personal values are under attack, we are under siege, and we have to stand up and defend ourselves. And you actually pair that with research done by a Yale law professor who pointed out that no matter how you segment a group in the United States, men, women, white, people of color, blue collar, white collar, no matter how you segment it up, every single group in the U.S. feels victimized. Every single one. So we have this collective victimization that then leads to a collective pessimism. Everybody feels like their rights are being taken away and we're moving backwards and everything is just going haywire and we just are so upset, and then we have to get angry about everything. Like politicians seize on this, right? They know like if we can get everybody angry about something, we can get them to follow along with us. And so whether you're on the left or the right, people will use anger as a motivator. And quite honestly, if you're like me, sometimes you're just tired of being angry about stuff. Right? Like even as a pastor, people get online and say, if your pastor didn't speak about this past week, you need to find a new church. And I get it, but man, there's so much that we could be angry about. Well, what are we supposed to do with that anger? And the reality is some of us have latched onto it almost as a crutch. Because here's what anger can do. The siege mentality, it actually brings some level of comfort in our lives. You think, well, why would anger bring comfort? Because when you're angry and you get caught up in the siege mentality, it makes sense of the world, right? It tells you who the good guys are and who the bad guys are. So you know who you should be cheering for. It also can give you a sense of identity because you know what? You're one of the good guys. And so you'll shape your entire life to take this political position. I'm going to have this worldview because I want to make sure I'm on the right side. And then it even explains all the bad things that happen in the world. Because the bad things always happen because of somebody else. I've never heard somebody say, you know what the problem with this world is me. No, it's always somebody else or some other group of people. And so we have all this pent-up anger. What are we supposed to do with it? And I found that there's some research that's absolutely fascinating. You can go look it up yourself if you want. But they were trying to figure out what is the best way to kind of get rid of anger in your life. And most of us, at least me, my thought is, you got to vent. You got to get your frustrations out. When I'm mad, I like to call up some friends and just complain. And so the technical term for that is catharsis, right? You go scream in a pillow, go punch a punching bag. You just got to vent all your anger out. And so I did one particular study. They've done a number of them like this, but I thought this one was interesting, where they took a massive group of people and they told them all to think about a person who has hurt you or who has angered you. And so they started working these people up. They had them share about it. And once they start getting angry, they take one group of people and put them in a room with a punching bag and say, get out all your anger and frustration. Then they took the other group and they put them in a room and said, okay, now I want you to develop a plan on how you are going to get fit physically. So on one hand, you have, let's punch this punching bag, let's get all our aggression out. And on the other hand, you're totally redirecting your thoughts. Now, which group do you think showed the greatest reduction in levels of anger? Like I would only be telling you that if it's that second group, right? Like the people who diverted their thoughts showed reduced levels. But that's not the interesting part. To me, the best part of this is that the first group that hit the punching bag, they actually showed increased levels of anger and increased tendencies towards violence, because they're actually reinforcing in their brain that when you get frustrated and upset, you react violently. You yell, you punch, you kick. And so the very thing that many of us think is releasing our anger is actually increasing it in our lives. We become a slave to the very thing that we're trying to get rid of. Now, I don't know about you, but then I start to think about that and look at my own life and say, ugh, maybe I got some work I need to do. We know what all these studies are saying, but what does Jesus say about anger? This morning, I want to look at some verses from Matthew chapter 5. This is part of a collection of Jesus' most famous teaching called the Sermon on the Mount. In fact, anytime somebody says, where should I start reading my Bible? I tell them, read Matthew chapter 5, 6, and 7. Read one chapter a day and just keep doing it for an entire month. Because I promise if you read these teachings of Jesus, you will come away with a view of the Christian life that is drastically different than what maybe some of us grew up with. Right? Jesus talks about turning the other cheek, loving your enemies. He teaches us how to pray. And in this particular passage we're about to read, he's talking to a first century Jewish audience. And they grew up, they knew the Old Testament, they'd memorized the scriptures. And he's going through something that is known theologically as the six antitheses, where he's saying, you have heard it said this. Like you've heard that scripture says, don't commit adultery, but I'm telling you, don't even lust after somebody else. And the idea is that Jesus is trying to give a full, broader understanding of the heart behind God's commands. Because I don't know if you ever have experience with little kids. You don't even have to have a kid yourself to know this. If you tell a kid, I don't want you to cross this line, what are they going to do? They're going to walk right up to the line, aren't they? So you say, hey, I don't want you playing on the sidewalk. They'll get the whole yard to play with. They're going to sit right there next to the sidewalk. And we do the same thing. If God says, don't do this, we want to see how close to that can I get. And Jesus the whole time is saying, no, I'm trying to show you the heart behind this. You understand why the command exists. Okay, now Jesus is going to start with this first antithesis, and it's all about anger. We're going to jump in Matthew chapter 5, starting in verse 21. He says, you have heard it said to our ancestors, do not murder, and whoever murders will be subject to judgment. But I tell you, everyone who is angry with his brother or sister will be subject to judgment. Whoever insults his brother or sister will be subject to the court. Whoever says, you fool, will be subject to hellfire. So Jesus said, you have heard it said, like in the scripture it says, don't murder people, right? Like that's pretty baseline. I think most people could probably agree that's a good idea not to murder each other. And he says, if you do, you're going to be in danger of judgment. Now, we know the Bible wasn't written in English. And in the original language, this word for murder here is specific. It's talking about a premeditated murder. This is like not an accident. It wasn't like, you accidentally got in a wreck and somebody lost their life. This is, you thought about it, you planned it, you executed your plan. And he says, if you do that, you will have judgment. Are we tracking so far? And that's important because the very next line, he says, but I tell you, if you're angry with someone, you're in danger of the same judgment. All right, to be clear, Jesus is saying, do not be angry. Anger is not a Christian virtue. It is actually a vice. And yet we live in a culture that holds it up as an example to be modeled. Like we should be angry and we should be upset. But it's not just Jesus, all throughout Scripture. In Psalm 37, verse 8, it says, refrain from anger and give up your rage. Do not be agitated. It can only bring harm. So it says, refrain from anger. Give up your rage. In Proverbs 22, verse 24, it says, don't make friends with an angry person and don't be a companion of a hot-tempered one. Don't be around angry people. And if you want to flip over to the New Testament in Ephesians chapter 4, verse 31, Paul says, let all bitterness and what? Anger, wrath, shouting, and slander be removed from you along with all malice. As Christians, our lives are not supposed to be marked by anger. And the idea here that when Jesus says, don't be angry, he's talking about like we're constantly angry, just given over to it, angry about everything. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. Well, wait a second, Matt. Didn't Jesus get angry about some stuff? And doesn't God get angry? Absolutely. Jesus got angry. Like when his disciples were preventing children from coming to him, Jesus got angry. When Lazarus, his friend, died, Jesus got angry. Even, it doesn't say Jesus was angry, but there's this point near the end of his ministry where he goes into the temple and he sees how they've turned it into a money-making scheme, and he goes in and flipping tables and stuff. I'm sure there's a little anger involved in that. And so it's this idea that there is a righteous kind of anger. And so we'll look and we'll say, well, I have a righteous anger. But see, here's the problem with that. You ready? Deep theological truth. You are not Jesus. All right, repeat after me. I am not Jesus. And see, here's the thing. Jesus can have a righteous anger, but for too many of us, we're horrible judges of our own motives behind our anger. In fact, for a lot of us, our anger is actually rooted in pride because you didn't get your way, because somebody offended you, because you didn't like the tone that that person took. And so we end up getting angry, and we justify it by saying a righteous anger, but nowhere in Scripture are we told to be angry. We're just told to not be angry. Now, that's a tall task, especially in our culture, which values this and which tells us we should be. Because we live in a culture that they call it virtue signaling, right? What you're angry about actually signals what you care about. So you got to be angry about the right things so people know you're on their team. And if you're not angry enough, then you're not even part of the team then. And so I'm angry about this issue, so people know I align over here, and I'm upset about this issue, so I align over here. And then to make matters worse, all of the media around us, I'm talking social media, what's on TV, all of that radio, it's just constant messages of anger and outrage. But if catharsis doesn't work, right? Because here's the thing, it's easy for Jesus to say, don't be angry. But you're going to pull out of the parking lot and you're going to get stuck at this light right out here, and you're going to be behind somebody who's not paying attention. They're on their phone. Light's going to turn green. They're not going to move. Then it's going to turn yellow. Then they'll go before it turns red, and you're stuck at the light. And you're going to be so ticked because you're going to be late to the Mexican restaurant for lunch. And we're going to have all these things that happen to us. You cannot avoid triggers for anger. So how do we make sure that we do not become people who are marked by anger? If catharsis doesn't work, is there another way? Well, I'm thankful that Jesus shows us yes. Look at the very next verse, verse 23. And Jesus says, so if you are offering your gift on the altar, and there you remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift there in front of the altar. First, go and be reconciled with your brother or sister, and then come and offer your gift. Reach a settlement quickly with your adversary while you're on the way with him to the court, or your adversary will hand you over to the judge, and the judge to the officer, and you will be thrown into prison. Truly, I tell you, you will never get out of there until you have paid the last penny. What on earth is Jesus talking about? We went from anger, and all of a sudden we're talking about offering a sacrifice. We're talking about heading to court. What on earth is Jesus saying? What Jesus is trying to point out is what anger does is anger always breaks relationships. It always manifests itself in our relationships with others. In fact, anger is cancer to community. Because when we start getting angry, we tend to push people away, right? Jesus started by saying, hey, don't be angry. Then he said, anyone who insults someone else, anyone who says you're a fool to someone else, our anger always manifests itself in our relationships. And so both of these examples are relational examples on how do we handle our anger. Now, I think there's a few points I want to just make real clear out of these verses. But before I do that, I want to tell you what we're going to talk about today. This is not anger management techniques. In fact, I think maybe if there are some of us here today and we really are given over to anger, I think counselors are a great resource. There's nothing to be ashamed of about that. I think we have to be careful because our own anger, how it manifests, actually impacts the people around us. Like we know that kids who are abused as children grow up to be abusers themselves. Like our anger, our rage can influence the generations that come behind us. It can cause stress in our marriage, in our work relationships, in our career. And so if this is something that's really a deep struggle for you, God has given us counselors for that exact reason. But what I want to walk through is how do we handle anger so that it doesn't manifest into broken relationships to begin with? See, Jesus gives these relational examples, but I think the very first thing he wants us to understand is that if we're going to overcome anger in our lives, we have to take responsibility. Here's what I mean. We have to admit, number one, that we actually have an issue with anger. Which, by the way, if you ever have to preach a sermon on anger, you will realize how angry you get during the week about every little thing. But not only do we take responsibility owning up to it, but the other thing we do is we have to take responsibility for limiting it in our lives. Like, we have to take ownership. God's not going to snap his finger and you're going to be a peaceful person. Like, you're not just going to wake up one day and be like, oh, I'm like Jesus and nothing bothers me and now I only have righteous anger. That's just not going to happen. We have to take responsibility. This is why when Jesus is talking to these people, well, we think he's about 80 miles away from Jerusalem. And he says, if you go to Jerusalem to offer a sacrifice, so 80 miles, they're going to go on foot. That's a 3-day journey. So Jesus is essentially saying, if you leave today and you make this 3-day journey to Jerusalem, you get there and you pay money so that you can have a perfect sacrifice. You go into the temple, you kind of walk through the process. You get all the way to the end, you're with the priest. You're about to make this offering, this sacrifice, and you get to that point and you remember not that you're mad at somebody else, but that somebody else has something against you. You just tell the priest, I'll be back in a week. And you turn right around and you travel 3 days back home. You fix that relationship, and then you can return to worship. See, Jesus doesn't want our worship until we've dealt with the anger in our own lives. And that means we have to take responsibility. And we talk all the time on our staff about this idea of BCD, blame, complain, defend. We want to blame other people for what's going on in our lives. We complain about our circumstances, or we defend our own actions. And by the way, you can tell you're spiritually immature if you're BCDing all the time. Like, if life is all about you and it's never your fault and you're not owning up, then it's just, I mean it in a loving way, but there's some maturity that needs to happen. Because here's what happens. We get angry, and what we do, we blame other people. Well, they made me angry. Right? If you ever have kids, they say, they made me do that. They made me angry. Or we complain about our circumstances. Well, you don't understand what it's like to work at my job, and you don't understand who I am married to. Or we defend ourselves. No, I should be angry. If you're not angry, something's wrong with you. And we BCD. But listen, we can only conquer anger when we stop BCDing, we stop trying to justify it as righteous anger, and we say, this is an area I need help with. And then we have to take responsibility to probably make some difficult decisions in our life about things that we need to cut out. Do you ever notice, like, the people that you're around start to influence how you behave? Like, here's a great example. Our staff, we just went on our annual retreat to do some planning for the next year. And I noticed something. Matt Wilson, our creative art director, he's a worship leader. He's a fantastic guy. But he has introduced this phrase to our staff. Like, if something goes on, he goes, golly. If you're ever around him, you're going to hear it. And what I started noticing, we're in the car ride on the way there, and all of a sudden, Amanda, our kids director, goes, golly. And then a little while later, our student director, Keith, goes, golly. And then we're sitting around doing some planning, and Julie and I are going, golly. It's like the people you are around start to influence how you behave. And some of us have so much anger in our lives because of the things we surrounded ourselves with. Like, you're constantly consuming cable news, or you're listening to talk radio wherever you drive, or even this, turning on ESPN. You know, all of these mediums, they're not trying to give you information. They're trying to produce anger and rage. In fact, a few years ago, ESPN made a pivot in how they do their programming. If you ever turn on ESPN, like, go home, turn it on at any point. If it's not sports, it's 4 grown men yelling at each other about sports, right? It's all debate-driven. And so you can think you're just consuming sports stuff, but it's all arguing, and you're just going to find yourself being more defensive and argumentative with other people. I think for some of us, taking responsibility means stop watching cable news. Turn off talk radio. Do you know, it's okay that you don't know everything that's going on in the world. I promise. I promise that you're not going to be the one to figure out the conflict in Ukraine that nobody's figured out. You know, it's okay if we don't know. And in fact, here's why I think anger over situations like that is anti-Christian. Because when we follow Jesus, we believe that he's bringing heaven to earth. And so we have hope. We don't have to worry about every little thing or get outraged about who said this and what happened over here, because guess what? We have a whole different plan entirely. We're not trying to manage this world. We're trying to create a new one within the one that already exists. And so as Christians, we ought to be marked by peace, not by anger. And yet some of the angriest people I know are people who claim to follow Jesus. I mean, even in that, I'm not like talking about anybody specific, but even sometimes when pastors teach, right? You're like, what are you so angry about, right? Like yelling at people and everything else. We should have this peace that surpasses all understanding. The world doesn't understand because they're given over to anger, but that can only happen if we take responsibility. There may be some good things in your life that you have to cut out because it doesn't help you look more like Jesus. Listen, if it doesn't help you become more like Jesus, cut it out. Get rid of it. Listen, you don't need Netflix to be like Jesus. I'm not telling you have to cut it out, but whatever it is in your life, there may be some decisions if you're going to take responsibility. Now, the other thing that Jesus notes here is that after we take responsibility, we have to initiate reconciliation. And I know that's a mouthful, all right? That's not like, you're not going to slip that into casual conversation later this week. Like, I'd like to initiate reconciliation. But I picked those words intentionally because the onus for all of this falls on who? On us. We are to initiate, right? Like if you're making your sacrifice and you remember somebody else has something against you, your attitude isn't, well, if they really cared about it, then they should have brought it up with me. Oh, well, you know, when they're ready to apologize, I'm ready to listen. No. We're not to wait till other people, we take the initiative to bring about reconciliation. That's relationships that come back together. Because here's what I've noticed. When we get angry with people, we push them away. In fact, I think there are some people here in this room, there's probably people that you haven't talked to in years because they hurt you and they angered you. You know, there's people that when you see them in the grocery store, you turn and walk the other direction because you can't even stand to be in their presence. Or maybe that's just me, I don't know. But I think there's these relationships that we push people away, and that goes back to that immaturity thing because we think they make me angry. So if I'm not around them, I won't be angry. But see, here's the thing. The anger exists within us. Somebody might hit a button where it comes out, but the anger exists in here. And I think so many times we're dealing with the fruit when we should be dealing with the root. Now that's a good preacher saying right there. In fact, I love it from the great American cinema classic, the Lego Movie. They say, you know it's true when it rhymes. Okay, so if it rhymes, it has to be true. But the reality is that the anger that gets directed towards other people, that's the fruit of something that's going on inside of us. And so we think if we just avoid people, we won't have the fruit, but you're still going to have those roots wrapped all around your heart. And we got to do some heart examination. We got to do the hard work. In fact, one of those church desert fathers was named John Cassian. And he said, you can avoid other people, but you can't avoid anger that's inside of you. He actually went out on his own into the desert. And he thought that if I'm finally away from everybody, then I won't be angry. Anybody ever feel that way? So I feel that way sometimes. Like, just get away from people, then I won't be angry. And then he's like, but then I would get angry when I couldn't chop the wood the way I wanted to. Or I would get angry when the sun was too hot. Or I got angry because there wasn't enough food. The anger will always find a way to come out. So we have to deal with we have to initiate that, and we have to do that in relationship with people. Like again, Jesus doesn't want your worship if you are so angry at someone you can't speak to them. Jesus says, deal with that first. We'll get to the worship later because we can worship with our mouth, but our lives dictate who we are really following. You know, you can be here every Sunday and worship, but are you really following Jesus if you're cutting people off? Now, I'm not talking about healthy boundaries. I think those are good. But what I am talking about is there are people that for whatever reason, they get under our skin. And they could just say good morning to you, and you're already angry at them. You don't even know why. And so we try to avoid them, but maybe instead of avoiding people, we ought to understand them. That's why Jesus says, if you're on your way to court and you have an adversary, he says, go ahead and settle things with them on the way. And kind of the phrasing there in the original Greek is like, make nice with them. Now, he doesn't say that enemy has to become a friend, but you know, an enemy doesn't have to stay an enemy either. And maybe there's some of us that we need to do that work. We need to initiate that reconciliation. And then the last thing, the church fathers really talked about this a lot. See, it's one thing to kind of start dealing with the anger, but you know you got to replace it with something else. And we always use this illustration. My kids, whenever we go to the beach, they like to dig holes. And then at a certain point, what does every kid do when they're digging down? They turn and dig sideways, right? We're going to dig a tunnel. And at first you can start to do it, but the more you pull out, what starts to happen to that tunnel? It all collapses in on itself. In the same way, we might pull anger out, but guess what? If we don't replace it with something, it's all going to keep caving back in on itself. You're just going to have to keep digging. So what do we replace it with? We have to pursue righteousness. Like, it's not enough just to stop anger. We have to pursue righteousness, which is really a fancy way of saying the two keys that the church fathers gave for overcoming anger. And you don't need me to tell you this. You're going to be like, you get paid to talk about this, to pray and to worship. But it's just very simple. Pray and to worship. Because here's the thing. If we want to be like Jesus, we should probably spend time with him. Because the more time you spend with Jesus, the more you become like Jesus. In fact, these desert fathers, they had set times of prayer throughout the day. It wasn't just they woke up in the morning and spent 5 minutes praying, but it was prayer in the morning, prayer in the midday, prayer at lunch, prayer in the afternoon, prayer at dinner, prayer in the evening, prayer before bed. It was this constant conversation. And it doesn't just have to be prayer about all the stuff you're angry about. But the more you stay connected with Jesus, the less you're going to worry about the things of this world. The less those people are going to get under your skin. Because what you're going to realize is the people who get under your skin are probably people that Jesus wants you to serve. People that Jesus wants you in relationship with. In fact, you know the desert fathers and mothers, they prayed through the Psalms, all 150 of them, every single week. And you're like, that is a lot of Bible and prayer time. But it's really not a lot if you break it down into chunks throughout the day. Just pray through a psalm here and there, all throughout the day. And then at the end of the week, you're praying. And they knew these psalms. They would go back to them in their moments of desperation. It's not just prayer. They also point out the importance of worship. Because what worship does is it takes our focus off all the stuff going on around us, and it puts the focus on Jesus. But when you talk about worship, I mean like real worship. Not like where we're singing a song, but you're thinking about the grocery list that you have to make later, but like really focusing on Jesus. Have you ever been in conversation with somebody and they're like texting somebody while you're talking to them? Anybody ever had that happen before? And do the impression you get is they don't really care, they're not really listening, and they might be, but there's an impression giving off that they're not. And I wonder if sometimes that's how we approach worship. We come in here and we're supposed to be focused on Jesus, but our mind is in a million different places. We're mentally scrolling, right? What do I have to do at work? What do I have to do this afternoon? All these things that need to get done before tomorrow morning. And man, what would it look like if we just took a moment to say, you know what, all the things we could be focused on, all the things to be angry about, we're pushing all that to the side and we're just going to focus on Jesus. See, that's really how we design our whole services here on Sunday. You didn't need this message, right? Like, you know this stuff already. You don't need a word from me. You need a moment with Jesus. And so that's what we're going to do. In just a minute, I'm going to pray. And then we have our communion stations around the room. And as you feel led, I'd invite you to get communion and sit down at your seat. And I know we've talked about these things, taking responsibility, initiating reconciliation, pursuing righteousness. All of us have one of those steps that we need to make today. I think maybe for some of us, as you sit there, it's just, maybe you just need some prayer time with Jesus, where for the first time you say, Jesus, I'm an angry person. And maybe you just admit that and just say, I want to surrender that to you. And I would love to tell you that in that moment, he's going to snap his fingers and it'll all go away. But the healing begins when we admit that we have an issue. Or maybe as you sit there, you need to think through and process, are there things that I do need to cut out? Are there things that are unnecessary that I need to cut out so I can become more like Jesus? Here's what I actually think. I think for some of us here today, you need to be bold enough. Don't even get communion. Don't sing as we worship. You need to send a text message to somebody and apologize. Maybe you need to step out in the lobby and make a phone call. Jesus says, leave your sacrifice at the altar. Go make sure things are right with that other person. I don't know who that is. Maybe it's a parent. Maybe it's a coworker. Maybe it's somebody who hurt you years ago. I don't know what that looks like, but Jesus says that is too important for you to go any further this morning without reconciling that relationship. And for some of us, it means we have to forgive people. Right? It costs nothing to forgive somebody, but it opens the door to true healing and freedom in our life. I think some of us are here today and you're captive because there's bitterness and hurt, and today is just forgiveness and reconciliation. That's what you need. Then maybe for some of us, it is just a moment to close our eyes, sit in the presence of Jesus, to take all of our agenda, all of our to-do list, to push it to the side, and just focus on him in a moment of true worship. And I believe if we'll do those things, we won't be a people marked by anger, but we'll be a church marked with a peace that surpasses all understanding. And the world will not understand what to do with that. It's because our hope is not in this world. Our hope is in Jesus, and he's come to bring heaven to earth. So all across this room, would you bow your heads and close your eyes with me? Jesus, we just come before you right now. And we just confess all of our anger, all of our rage. We confess to you the ways we've shouted and slandered. As we confess that, would you forgive us? Jesus, right now, show us the things in our life that aren't helping us become more like you, and give us strength to remove them. And Jesus, I pray especially for those right now who need to initiate reconciliation. If it's a text message, if it's a call, whatever it is, God, give them the strength not to go another minute, but right now to do that, because we want to worship you where we don't have to hold anything back. We can passionately pursue you, and we want to be a people who are at peace with those around us as far as it depends on us, Jesus. So give us strength. And I pray in this moment, you to remove everything from our mind. Help us just to focus on you, because we just want to be more like you, Jesus. It's in your name I pray. Amen. As you feel led, you can take communion.